From Volcanology to Greek mythology, the new House of Dragons TV show raises questions that I want your help with. I look forward to your responses. I'm Luke, and this is polýMATHY.
He would not dare withhold them in the face of the realm's need. Who is he to act to me?
No one, your grace.
So this stood out to me. Who is he to Hector me? To Hector is a direct reference to the Trojan War. And the greatest warrior of the Trojans was Hector, who would taunt the Greeks. So to Hector means to be arrogant, blustering, and so forth. And it works perfectly for what he's talking about. But the only reason that it works is that we know who Hector was in mythology. And the Game of Thrones universe, the Song of Ice and Fire, here the House of Dragons, it doesn't have anything to do with the world of Greek mythology. And maybe they have a Hector in their universe and so forth. And it really stood out to me because it's like calling someone a doubting Thomas. That's a reference to the New Testament. Or saying only Nixon can go to China.
Only Nixon could go to China.
Now, I'm not saying making references to part of our world are bad. And this is a fantasy, epic kind of show, and the books as well are taking place in a fantastical version of our own world. So because of that, and the fact that obviously this is fantasy, we have to take for granted several things that would actually be impossible. The fact that they're all speaking English. English is standing in for their common language. So my question for those who've actually read the books, because I haven't, is this actually something that George R.R. Martin actually uses in the dialogue of the books to Hector? Or is this something that the Hollywood writers are doing? I'm not saying it's wrong to do this, considering that they're using all kinds of English language terminology, which is inseparable from the history of, say, the Roman Empire and the French kingdom and the English kingdom and so forth. So it's implausible for them to use all kinds of constructions and manners of expression. It just really stood out to me and took me out of the story for a second.
The Valyrian capital was built into a volcano, much like Dragonstone.
The fact that he says volcano by name also really stands out to me, because look at this word, volcano. It doesn't come from an Anglo-Saxon or Norman French origin. It comes to us from Italian. It's an alteration of Vulcano, which is actually the name for the god Vulcan, the forger, the smith in ancient Greco-Roman mythology. The fact that this is yet another reference to our mythology and not to their mythology, well, that's interesting. But the other thing that really caught my ear was the fact that volcano as a term and as a scientific concept, we take for granted that we understand that. But that's not something that the ancients knew. Classical Latin didn't even have a word for volcano. In modern Latin, we usually say mons ignivomerus or igniferus or igneus, a fiery mountain. The reason that volcano is such a recent addition to the English language is because it's only pretty recently that we understand, thanks to modern science, what volcanoes are. An active volcano may have an eruption cadence spanning hundreds, thousands, or even millions of years. So to make those kinds of observations over time and to really figure out what these things are, that takes a lot of very careful study and attention. Now, it's also possible if in the world of the Song of Ice and Fire, there are lots of volcanoes, and if they're sufficiently regular, that they would have a name for them. And then a word like volcano is justified. So my question, is the word volcano used in the books? And does George R.R. Martin actually give a reason for why they actually know what volcanoes are with greater frequency than, say, medieval Europeans who didn't understand the concept? While we today take for granted that something like Mount Etna and Mount Vesuvius are the same thing in our conception, which is a volcano, it wasn't that evident to ancient peoples.
I may begin to ensure that we are better defended.
Against who?
Whomever may dare to challenge us.
Against whom is perfectly correct, but whomever may is totally wrong. And that's because may is the verb of that sentence, and the subject is the pronoun that precedes it. And that pronoun has to be whoever, or even just who would be fine, but not whom or whomever. And that's because what he's actually saying is actually a shorter version for something longer. Against them whoever may dare. Now that sounds archaic, and we don't really use this construction anymore, but that's what it stands for. So against whom is fine, but whomever may, no, that's totally wrong. And this is probably because, I'm guessing, the Hollywood writers simply don't understand this concept, and I don't really blame them because those kinds of grammatical errors are really, really common in something like this, where they're trying to sound fancy and highfalutin, and they miss the mark because they don't understand grammatical concepts like subject and verb and so forth. But my question to you, if you've read the books, is, does George R.R. Martin actually make these kinds of mistakes? Or does he use grammatical mistakes to give certain personality traits to his characters? A lot of authors do that. In my comments here, I'm not trying to prescribe that using whom and who correctly and other pronouns is necessary for everybody. Far from it. The reality is that most native speakers of English don't have a command of these things anymore. They're just really not part of their internal grammar. This is how languages change. But it stands out to me because the character, this king, is supposed to be highly educated and also speaking in a way that is at least like 100 years ago British royalty and not like modern day people who don't understand those differences. So that's why it stands out to me and why I think writers need to be really careful. If you're going to say against whom, which is correct, but a little bit old-fashioned, then you have to use the next thing right, which was the whoever and not whomever. But those are just some little nitpicks that I saw, and they don't really take away from my enjoyment of the show. What do you think? So far, this new installment in the Game of Thrones universe seems to be a lot better than the 8th season of Game of Thrones.
I see this as an absolute win.
Are you a fan of these shows or books? Do you speak to your cat in High Valyrian and Dothraki?
I throat rip.
What? Agenda!
Louder, you're shouting it from the back of a horse.
What? Agenda!
I want to know. Write in the comments. Thanks so much for watching and sharing. Walete.